Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I am your moderator, Karl Cassell, Executive Director of Regional Economic Development Institute. And we are glad that you've chosen to join us this morning for a conversation that might have some believing that something amazing is happening, or some of you are becoming more increasingly scared of this inevitable approaching future, or the remainder of you might think this is all crazy sci-fi talk and choose to ignore it. But today we're going to pay very close attention to the direction that this technology and life is taking us. So joining me today, we have Lauris, Kaldjian, Professor and Director at the University of Iowa in the program of Bioethics and Humanities. Good morning.
Thank you.
And next to him, Juan Pablo Hourcade, Associate Professor at the University of Iowa, Department of Computer Science. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Karl.
And Rob Merritt, writer and playwright, who is joining us also. And we'll talk about a film that is currently out.
Good morning, Karl.
And so let's jump right into it. I'll give people a definition of our topic, and it is transhumanism. It is an international and intellectual movement that aims to transform the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies to greatly enhance human intellect and physiology. So talk to me about the three terms that kind of guide this science: transhumanism, posthuman, or transhuman. How would you guys look at the study of this field and this science as it's developing today? Anyone?
So I can start. So one way I look at technology is that technologies have always been making us superhumans in some ways if we think about what we were able to do in the past. So think about what reading and writing did, for example. All of a sudden, a lot of information that you might have had to recall on your own, you could now actually write it down. You didn't have to forget it anymore. If we think about some of the things we can do with technology nowadays, with smartphones, you can access more information than anyone could have accessed at the largest library available just a few years ago. And you can do it very quickly, inexpensively. You can connect yourself with just about anyone in the world and talk to them. If we had told someone that we had disabilities 100 years ago, they would have said we're superhuman. We don't see it that way because everyone has access to this technology. So in some ways, I think we have already been giving ourselves these superpowers, which is because everyone has them and some of the changes have been gradual. Sometimes we don't see them as superpowers. At the same time, it does not mean that whenever we have a new technology, everything's positive. Sometimes there could be negative consequences to having these superpowers. And we can talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think what I'm struck by is that from the medical perspective, and I'm a physician as well as someone who works in medical ethics, I'm struck by how traditionally medicine has been focusing on something that we call health, something that's normative, that is commonly perceived as the way human beings are supposed to be. And health has certain parameters, certain boundaries. But the transhumanist aim is to go beyond those boundaries. And so now, as it were, the sky is the limit. And so there isn't a normative standard that we learned. For instance, as a medical student, I took anatomy and I took physiology, and then I took pathology. So we have normal and then we have abnormal. So one would imagine, for instance, if this sort of a project were to go forward in the future, what would that course in medical school look like and sound like? And who would have the wisdom to be able to teach a medical student where are the targets, the goals, what are the aims now of this medical technology, as opposed to the desire to restore health or to get as close back to health as you can.
And what I find really fascinating about transhumanism as a concept is it challenges the very notions that people have about what it is to be human in the first place. The idea that if certain things that transhumanists are advocating for actually were to go forward, their whole thinking centers around the idea of escaping the limits of the human body, whether it's increasing performance, increasing ability, or extending life itself. But if you believe that that's possible to do, it comes down to, do you think that the bodies we have are all that there is, and that it's up to science to keep us alive as long as possible? Or do you believe that we have souls, that there is something more to us that technology can't replicate? And everyone comes down on different sides of that, but I think that that transhumanism forces people to confront those beliefs and start asking questions that we never thought we would be asking because of what technology is suddenly making it possible for us to do.
So let me ask almost two questions here. So the technology will enhance abilities at some point, which will put pressure on each one of us to kind of rise to that new normal. If we start thinking of end of life, does it start to creep into eugenics? Anyone? We'll start with the doctor.
Well, so one first has to be very careful about defining eugenics. Mm-hmm. And it can be treated somewhat differently by different folks, but one of the more straightforward ways to think about it is that eugenics is the aim of eugenics is to improve the genetics of a population, the so-called gene pool. Mm-hmm. And you can do that in what's either called positive or negative ways. Mm-hmm. So in positive eugenic schemes, you want to select for the traits that are considered desirable. Right. In negative schemes, you want to eliminate traits that are undesirable. And so, historically in the last 100 years, we've seen some terrible examples of what eugenics can be, and that's why to this very day eugenics has a very bad connotation to it. But at the same time, I think we have to be honest about the fact that eugenic schemes do exist in the current day.
Yep.
Either if you think about how people can use in vitro fertilization and sperm banks as well as egg donors to select for traits that they would like to have in a child that's at least maybe partially biologically their own. Also, when you think about prenatal screening for traits or genetic conditions that are deemed undesirable, and even termination or abortion to eliminate that life. So we already are practicing such things. My sense from a quick, snooping around on the web on transhumanism and eugenics is that there are at least some transhumanists who would not want to be associated with eugenics because they're not in favor of eliminating anyone, but they want to actually improve and enhance the capacities and powers of whoever voluntarily wants to be enhanced. So I think it's an open question as to what the relationship between transhumanism and eugenics would be, and I think you'd have to ask a transhumanist, where do you stand on those questions? Does that seem what you would suggest, Ron?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. I'm sort of curious on a computer science level, where since you work so closely with it, where you think computer science is going to enter into the transhumanism debate. The projects that you're working on, is there any parallel between that and what some of these transhumanists are arguing as far as extending human life or copying certain parts of the body digitally? Is there anything to that?
It's not a topic that comes up often among computer scientists. I actually brought up the topic in a reading group at my department today, and we looked up the definitions and started talking about it. I think from a computer science perspective, there will be a lot of steps before we got to anything resembling some of the things that you were referring to earlier. So I think we tend to think a little bit more about the steps that are a little bit closer to us right now. And I think that's where we might be able to start answering some of the ethical questions at that point, because we're not going to all of a sudden go from where we are today to having, to being able to reproduce a human exactly, try to put their brain on the cloud and, and have them start interacting with other brains on the cloud. We're nowhere near that, and there will be a lot of intermediate steps, and I think a lot of the difficult questions might start being answered as we make progress, and we might be able to develop more sophisticated artificial intelligence systems. At the same time, what I have to say from a computer science perspective, replicating humans may not be the primary goal, but just making smarter machines, which may not necessarily be human-like.
Well, that's something that I have done some reading about as far as AI goes, is that most AI programs right now, they're still basically executing commands, at a very high level, but they're being told, if this happens, do this, if this happens, do this. Whereas the way that the human brain works, like both its learning capacity and the way that it filters information, as I understand it, that's something that AI engineers are still trying to get closer to, is making a computer think the way that a human does, and just the very structure, the very approach that AI takes to making decisions versus how humans make decisions is right now so far apart, and how do you make that gap closer? And I don't know if you've done any work in that area, or if you have better insight on that.
Yeah, so artificial intelligence is not my area within computer science, but what I can say is generally artificial intelligence works better for very narrow domains. So learning to play chess, for example. So now they're better than humans in that, or Jeopardy. Mm-hmm. That's another example. Those are relatively narrow domains where there's only so many things you have to do. Mm-hmm. Now, once you get to the complexity of activities that humans do, then computers are nowhere near the ability of humans to handle all the diversity of stimuli that we get in decision making that we have to go through.
But if we continue along this road, will it put pressure on each human to kind of rise? And I'll use a simple analogy like baseball. Not the anabolic steroids, but laser surgery on your eyes so you can better see the ball coming. Would it start affecting athletes? Would it start affecting people in business? If you are ramping up to get to even entry-level jobs, if this was the case, would it start putting pressure on different professions across the board? What do you guys think?
I think how many people can have a successful career, say, today without using the internet? Right, so that's a bionic eye in a way, right?
True story.
But I'd want to suggest, though, that even though there are relationships between sort of life-enhancing at their best technologies, but it's like standing on a ladder. All of a sudden, I'm taller than I was. And some might call that a human enhancement for the period of time that I stand on the ladder. But I can quickly discard the ladder, and it hasn't changed my nature. I think the transhumanist discussion really is about changing human nature. So in the way that applied science, some would say, is about the conquest of nature. Transhumanism is about the conquest of human nature.
Yes, it is.
And so I think, to your question about actually doing things to our bodies and to our minds is very real. And I think if you were to interview college students today, and ask them what their perception is about the frequency of stimulant use to concentrate better in preparation for examinations, you would probably get answers, I'm told from reading newspaper articles, that students are doing this. And so there could be already a sense in that one domain where a cognitive enhancing pharmaceutical agent is being used to try to rise to the competition of those people around you.
Right.
Well, and there's something to the idea of society as a collective coming to accept things that a few decades before would have been unthinkable. I mean, the idea, for example, of people being microchipped or being able to constantly be tracked by GPS. 30 years ago, that would have been a sci-fi story, and people would have been like, that sounds horrible. But now you hear parents saying, oh, that would be great. I'd always know where my child is, and they'd never get lost. I mean, I've seen people, or people who get microchipped. I was reading about people who are getting implants in their fingers so that they can hold their hand up to a security door and immediately have their information read, or they have, or like their digital records in case something happens to them and EMTs need to check something on them. They've got these implants that say that, and people are becoming more accepting of that sort of thing. And so as far as your question of will people feel pressure, it might not be pressure so much as it's just not a big deal anymore. I mean, I did a lot of, and I'm sure you're way more versed on this, but I remember reading that it used to be that organ transplants were a very controversial thing when they were first being proposed. The idea of having a heart transplant was very controversial because you can't replace someone's heart, but now it's that's the organ transplants are widely accepted science.
But there too, I think what's remarkable about transhumanism is it's going beyond that. Now I agree with you that the technology of a heart transplant is remarkable.
Right.
And even the notion of the heart, right? It's of all the organs of the body, it has a very special place in the way we think about human beings. But to restore the function of the heart as opposed to exceeding the natural function of the heart, those, I think, are the questions that the transhumanist agenda really presses on us in terms of saying, listen, is human nature simply good as a gift that we receive as human beings, as part of our lives, and it has already in it all that we need to flourish, assuming we're healthy. And even if we're not fully healthy, we can still flourish, as opposed to the transhumanist agenda that says, hey, this is material to be conquered by science and biotechnology, to be molded in new ways that exceed limitations, because limitations are sort of the bad word to the transhumanist, right? We're not supposed to be limited.
But it gets murky also when you look at something like, say, the brain. If someone figured out how to eventually digitize human neurons, you could argue that that is a legitimate attempt to treat Alzheimer's, that someone could protect their brain before Alzheimer's destroys it, and I think that subject right now sounds unfathomable, that you could replace your brain or make an artificial brain. But we have artificial hearts and we have other artificial organs, and I mean, if technology got to that point, and it's a long ways away, but if technology got to that point, is it escaping the human body, or is it, like you say, simply trying to medically take care of ourselves?
Well, I think that would be, even your use of the word protection, that is very consistent with also, vaccination is to protect you from getting something you haven't gotten yet. So if you protected the neurons from the onset of Alzheimer's, I think this is the question that's so real, I would say, for physicians and surgeons. In fact, I can remember once being asked by a patient if I would prescribe a drug called modafinil, which is an alertness enhancing drug. She was healthy, but she wanted to do more and sleep less.
Yeah, imagine that.
And I had to explain that was not my understanding of a concept of health. I suggested that getting a good night's sleep was the natural, healthy way to live well, but she wanted something else. And so physicians are going to have to ask themselves these questions, and very serious, and I think in increasing ways as the biotechnology continues to offer these new possibilities.
So, would you call it messing with human nature? Are we extending beyond what most people would say is the normal functions, as you guys talk about it? Would people look at it and say there are ethical issues, we should probably pump our brakes a little bit? Any of you?
I think whenever you have a new technology, all these ethical issues come up and people become very concerned. So if we go back to the Greeks, some Greeks were very concerned about writing and how that was going to change human nature. You go back to the 19th century, some people in Britain were very concerned about the popularity of novels, because all of a sudden people were spending hours reading and not talking to other people. And I would say nowadays we have an equivalent with smartphones getting in the way of face-to-face interactions and having other impacts. So I think whenever we bring new technologies, they do change how we interact with each other. They change the ways we get information, how we make decisions. So in some ways they're changing some of our nature. They're not changing our bodies per se. I think that's where perhaps there's a little bit of a difference between most of the technologies that we use and that change our society and some of the things that you might be thinking of with transhumanism.
Well, and let me interject, but we would be putting, at least from what I see, we would be putting computers or technology into our person and kind of taking us to that next level. So the writing and some of those things, yeah, it's understandable, but it's not quite it's not quite equal when we look at, to your point, we are going beyond human functions.
And I think especially given the potential for genetic technologies.
Right.
And you've heard in the news about this CRISPR gene editing technology, which is stronger and easier and less costly. And it's one thing to think about repairing genetic defects, but it's another thing to think about selecting for things and trying to improve on things. And I think to answer your question, there are definitely profound ethical questions about what is human nature? Are we bodies only? Are we bodies and souls? Are we ensouled bodies, as some theologians have said, and I happen to agree with that, that we are a combination, a remarkably mysterious combination of body and soul. But at the same time, I think that the question is not only how might it change human nature, but how will it also change human society? And someone, for instance, the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, in his article in the Atlantic Monthly called "The Case Against Perfection," argues, I believe, very persuasively about how the move towards the hyper-agency of taking control and becoming master of your own nature, as it were, is going to have remarkable effects, especially on giving up a sense of the giftedness of human life, so that we start to now almost look around ourselves and say, well, now we expect everyone to become hyperactive in promoting their own enhancement, and if you don't, somehow you're not doing your part.
Right.
Well, you know, going back to what you were asking before about pressure to, you know, I'm fascinated by what they're doing now with artificial limbs, where they've, you know, with studying brain patterns to the point that someone who gets an artificial hand can, with their brain, make a hand move just like the one that was there before did. And if that technology continues to evolve, though, imagine if it gets to the point where you have a hand that's now stronger than a human hand. Yep. And maybe it's able to carry out tasks better than your original hand was. Well, are we going to get to a point where people who work in manual labor or athletes decide, you know, I could just replace my arm and I could get an arm that I can't ever hurt it, and it's stronger than my arm before and I can perform better? And then that's going to go right into your question about, you know, what are we? Because how much can you do that? How much of your body can you replace before you're not you anymore?
Right. And then it would start creeping into living longer. So instead of it being unbelievable that someone lives to age 90 or even 100, you'd have people living to 150, 200 years old. Is that dangerous for society? It makes me slightly nervous, but because now we're talking even to be able to reproduce longer. There's a lot of things that go into it. Staying in the workforce, what's too old? There's a lot of issues from a social impact that would bear on extending lives and extending healthier, longer lives.
And I think you make a wonderful point to show that this is not just a question about individuals, their self-determination, their autonomy. This is profoundly a sense of the human community, and realizing that one person's decision has an impact on other people, and we need to reckon with that.
Yeah. Any thoughts from either one of you?
I think, like many other technologies, a lot of it is going to be about convenience. I think the real dangers one real danger that we haven't talked about is when only very few have access to the enhancements or the technology. And that's where I think things can get very dicey.
Starts to cause the divide in society, which is another issue. Yeah.
No, but you're right too. Technology is shaped by convenience. It's shaped by what people want. And sometimes people don't know what they want.
Right.
You know, I think it was it Ford that said that if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Yeah.
Like they had no concept of the car.
Yep.
Steve Jobs used to say things like that, that he gave people things that they didn't even know they wanted.
Right.
But once they're out there, everybody wants them.
But you know, this question that you raised about access, you could use the word justice to say it's a question of fair distribution
Social justice,
of the advantages in life. I think we also have to remember, though, that we already have great injustices
True
in
story.
terms of access to the good things in life that especially allow children to be raised in remarkably wonderful environments versus less privileged environments. So I think some of the transhumanists might sort of turn the argument back and say, if you're concerned about justice, you already have plenty of work to do that you're not doing enough of. And so transhumanist sort of agendas are simply adding more fuel to that ongoing fire.
Absolutely.
I think the thing to remember is technology can often act as an amplifier in this case.
That's a great
So
point.
that's the concern.
Yeah, that's a serious concern. Well, we only have a couple, 3 minutes. Rob, if you would tell us a little bit about Amelia 2.0 before we get out of here.
Yeah, no, it's a film that's in theaters right now, and you can view it on Amazon. And it came from a stage play that I wrote because I was fascinated by this topic, by the idea that what if you could talk to somebody who you've lost, and the story is around a young couple where the woman suffers an aneurysm and is put into locked-in syndrome, and her body's dying, but her brain is perfectly healthy. And her husband is desperate to find a cure, and there's a company that wants to build the first ever digital version of a human brain. And they get him to sign over power of attorney and rights to do it. And once they create this, then it becomes a question of, is she still the woman that she was before this procedure happened? And her own husband isn't sure about that. And I tried to write it in a way that it didn't take a side on that. That it was just, hey, this is technology that, I don't know how far away it is, but there's a lot of scientists out there who are saying this is plausible. And if it happened, what are the ethical concerns that would happen? And would you want this done to you or not? And what's been great about this project is it's generated so much discussion about that question. When we did the play at Theater Cedar Rapids, we had people stay around for like an hour afterward debating this issue. And I think that's great because this topic isn't here yet, but it's good to talk about it now like we're doing here. It's a fascinating subject.
Appreciate it. Well, we certainly barely scratched the surface on this issue. I'm so grateful you guys were able to join us. Transhumanist thinkers study the potential benefits and dangers of emerging technologies that could overcome fundamental human as well as ethical limitations of using such technologies. This is the dilemma that is surely going to cause some discomfort, but more importantly, great debate to determine if this is the next best course for human development. I hope that you will continue to pay close attention to the varying aspects on this issue in order to help adapt to the inevitable technologies that are upon us. Thank you for joining us today and hope that we'll see you again on another episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News. I want to thank our guests for joining us this morning on such a big but very important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karl.